At 19, she was forced to wed the most feared Alpha King, all to save her pack from ruin. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Sarah Ashmore stood at the edge of the council room, her fingers gripping the cold stone frame of the door. The room behind her buzzed with low murmurs, the voices of elders and leaders of the pack, all whispering in fear and anticipation. Sarah couldn't bring herself to enter yet, not when she knew what was about to be decided. The air in the pack house was thick with tension. Her family, the Ashmore pack, was on the brink of collapse. For months, their resources had dwindled, and the land they once ruled with pride now lay barren. The neighboring packs were starting to take notice, and the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, the feared Cale Thornridge, was sending his emissaries with a single demand: Sarah's hand in marriage. It was a political move, of course, but it was also the only thing that could save her pack. If she agreed to marry him, their lands would be spared. If not, the pack would be dissolved, their people scattered, and her family's legacy would be erased. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, staring at the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The thought of marrying the Alpha King was terrifying. She had heard the stories of his cold, ruthless rule, his power that shook the very foundations of the territories. He was the one who had risen from the ashes of his brutal past, the one who was said to have no mercy, no weakness. And now, her fate rested in his hands. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her like a physical burden. Her pack, her family, and the lives of all those she loved depended on her saying yes. The sound of footsteps approaching broke her from her thoughts. Elder Rowan, the wise old leader of the pack, appeared at her side, his face drawn with sorrow. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice heavy with regret, "it's time. You know what needs to be done." She nodded, though her throat tightened with emotion. Her world had been turned upside down in a matter of days. She had spent her life preparing for the responsibilities of leadership, but never once had she imagined it would come to this. Marrying a king to save her pack. Was this truly the only way? "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I never thought it would come to this." Rowan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones that define us. You're stronger than you think, Sarah." With a final deep breath, Sarah stepped forward into the room. The murmurs died down as all eyes turned to her. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the pressure of their expectations. She was their last hope. She couldn't afford to falter now. As she walked to the center of the room, the heavy wooden doors creaked closed behind her, sealing her fate. She lifted her head high, determined not to let the fear show in her eyes. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the future of her people, and no matter how hard it was, she would do whatever it took to save them. The room fell silent, waiting for her to speak, for her to make the decision that would change everything. And as Sarah Ashmore stood before them, she knew one thing for certain. Her life was no longer her own. It belonged to the Alpha King now. Sarah stood in the grand hall of the pack house, the weight of the moment settling heavily on her shoulders. The room was silent, every eye fixed on her as she walked toward the center, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the gaze of her pack, their hopes and fears pressing against her, but she couldn't let it show. Her mind raced with the enormity of what was about to happen. She was about to become the bride of the most feared alpha in the entire kingdom, a man known for his ruthlessness and unyielding power. But she had no choice. If she refused, her pack would be destroyed. Her family would be scattered to the wind. She had always known that being the heir to the Ashmore pack meant carrying a heavy burden, but she never imagined it would lead to this. The door to the council room behind her opened, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hall. The guards had returned. The Alpha King, Cale Thornridge, had arrived. She couldn't see him yet, but she could feel the tension in the air. The Alpha King was a figure of legend. His name was whispered with fear and awe throughout the entire kingdom. He was the one who had slain his father in a brutal battle for the throne, and since then, no one had dared to challenge him. His rule was absolute, and his presence, overwhelming. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She wasn't afraid of him, not exactly, but the power he wielded was undeniable. The room was filled with the rustle of fabric as everyone stood to welcome the Alpha King. The moment was here, and there was no turning back. Sarah straightened her back, lifting her chin as she prepared to face the man who would be her husband. The door swung open, and there he stood, Cale Thornridge. Tall, broad-shouldered, and imposing. His dark eyes swept over the room, and for a moment, they landed on Sarah. The air seemed to freeze, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. His gaze was intense, studying her as if weighing her worth, and yet there was a coldness to it, as if he saw her as nothing more than a pawn in his game. She felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm. "You're late," she said, her voice steady, though her insides churned. Cale's lips twitched into a half-smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I apologize for the delay," he replied, his voice deep and commanding. The journey was long. He approached her, and Sarah could feel the heat of his presence as he drew closer. She resisted the urge to step back, reminding herself that she was doing this to save her pack. "I trust you understand the gravity of what this marriage means," Cale continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your pack's survival depends on it." Sarah nodded, though inside, her heart felt heavy. She understood all too well. This was no fairy tale. She wasn't marrying for love or even for companionship. She was marrying to ensure the survival of those she loved. "I understand," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Cale studied her for a long moment, as if searching for something, before he gave a slight nod. "Good," he said, his voice softening just a fraction. "Then let us proceed." With that, he extended his hand to her, a simple gesture, but one that felt like the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could control. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then placed her hand in his. The instant their skin touched, she felt a spark of electricity shoot through her, a connection she hadn't expected. She looked up at him, her heart racing. There was no turning back now. The ceremony had begun, and her fate was sealed. As Sarah took Cale's hand, she felt a jolt of energy surge through her, though she couldn't quite place what it was. She had heard stories about the Alpha King, his strength, his power, and the way he ruled with an iron fist, but none of that prepared her for the feeling of being this close to him. His grip was firm, his presence undeniable. He didn't speak again as he led her through the grand hall, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent room. Her mind raced, but she tried to focus on the task at hand. Her pack's survival, the future of her people, depended on this marriage. There was no room for doubt or hesitation. Cale's grip tightened slightly, a silent assurance that he was in control. As they walked, Sarah stole a glance at him, wondering what kind of man he truly was beneath the reputation. He was tall, commanding, his face chiseled like stone, but there was something more in his eyes. Something guarded. She couldn't quite read it. As they reached the center of the hall, Cale stopped, turning to face her. The weight of the moment seemed to settle in. His gaze never left hers. "Are you sure you understand what this means, Sarah?" he asked, his voice low, but tinged with something almost soft. It was the first time he'd spoken to her like this, without the forceful edge of command. She nodded, keeping her gaze steady. "I understand." Cale's eyes searched hers for a moment longer before he nodded. In return, his expression unreadable. "Good. This is not a decision I make lightly." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Sarah had no doubt that Cale Thornridge never did anything lightly. He was a king, a ruler who had fought for every inch of his power. She could feel it now, in the way he carried himself, the way his very presence seemed to fill the room. He was everything they said he was and more. But even as she stood there, the reality of her situation started to sink in. She was marrying this man, not for love, not for desire, but to save her people. There was no other choice. She couldn't afford to let herself be swept away by the uncertainty or the fear that threatened to creep in. "I didn't want this," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I'll do what it takes." Cale's expression softened, just for a moment, before he masked it again with his usual stoic composure. "I never expected you to want this, Sarah. But your courage is what will see us through. Your pack will be safe, and so will you." He stepped closer, and for a brief moment, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. His scent surrounded her, a mix of pine and something deeper, darker, more primal. It was a reminder that this was real, that this wasn't just some dream or fantasy. This was her new reality. Her life was about to change forever. With a deep breath, Sarah squared her shoulders and faced the future. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on. She had no choice. The moment they'd been waiting for was upon them. As the ceremonial bell tolled, Sarah's heart beat in time with it, a silent prayer for strength. This wasn't the life she had imagined, but it was the life she had to live. And with that, the ceremony began. The ceremony was nothing like Sarah had expected. The grand hall was adorned with candles, their soft glow casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. The air was thick with the scent of incense, a subtle reminder of the ancient rituals that had brought her to this moment. The sound of murmured prayers and whispered blessings filled the room, but it was the weight of silence that truly enveloped her. As she stood before the gathered assembly, her heart raced, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. Her hands trembled slightly, but she clenched them into fists, determined not to show fear. She could not afford to falter. She was here for one reason only, to save her pack. Cale stood beside her, his presence imposing and unyielding. His eyes, once cold and distant, now seemed to watch her with a curious intensity, as if waiting for something. He said nothing, offering no reassurance, but somehow, his quiet strength was enough. The priestess, an elderly woman draped in flowing white robes, began the ceremony with a prayer, her voice steady and clear. Sarah barely heard the words, her focus entirely on the man beside her. The weight of the ring in her hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. It was a symbol of the life she was about to enter, a life she had never wanted, but one she had no choice but to accept. The priestess turned to Sarah, her eyes kind yet filled with the same sense of duty that Sarah felt. "Do you, Sarah Ashmore, accept Cale Thornridge, the Alpha King, as your mate, to rule by his side and protect your pack, your people, and your future?" The question hung in the air like a cloud, and Sarah's throat tightened. She knew the answer. She had known it since the moment she had agreed to this union. "I do," she said, her voice firm despite the uncertainty swirling inside her. The words felt heavy on her tongue, but she meant them. Her people depended on her. The priestess nodded, signaling that it was Cale's turn. He turned to Sarah, his eyes dark and unreadable. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the silence stretching between them. Cale's voice finally broke through, low and commanding. "Do you, Cale Thornridge, accept Sarah Ashmore as your mate, to protect her, honor her, and build a future together?" The question was the same, yet there was something different in the way he asked it. It wasn't just a formality, it was a promise, an acknowledgement of the weight they both carried. Cale's gaze never wavered as he turned to Sarah. "I do," he said simply, and with that, the pact was sealed. The ring was placed on Sarah's finger, a symbol of their bond, and the room erupted into applause. But Sarah barely heard it. All she could hear was the beating of her own heart, the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins. She was no longer just Sarah Ashmore, the daughter of a fallen pack. She was now Sarah Thornridge, the queen of the Northern Territories. The weight of the title settled heavily on her shoulders, but it wasn't fear she felt. It was something else, a quiet strength, a sense of purpose she had never known before. Cale took her hand, and for the first time, she felt the connection between them. It wasn't love, not yet, but there was a spark, a flicker of something that could one day grow into something more. "Welcome, my Luna," Cale whispered, his voice barely audible, but the words sent a shiver down her spine. She had been chosen, not by fate, but by necessity. And for the first time, Sarah Ashmore realized that she was no longer a pawn in someone else's game. She was a player, and she would fight for her pack, for her people, and for the future she would build with the man who stood beside her. Sarah stood at the balcony of the palace, the cool night air brushing against her skin as she gazed out over the vast lands that now belonged to her, a kingdom she had never imagined ruling. Below her, the lights of the city flickered like stars, and the sounds of the celebration echoed up to where she stood, alone in her thoughts. She had married Cale Thornridge, the Alpha King, but what did it really mean? Was this truly the future she had fought for, or had she simply become another pawn in a game much bigger than herself? The weight of the ring on her finger seemed heavier now. It was a symbol of everything she had sacrificed, everything she had chosen. Yet, as the days passed, she began to wonder if she had made the right decision. The king was a powerful man, but he was also a stranger. Their marriage, though necessary, was built on a foundation of duty, not love. And while she could feel a growing bond between them, it was a connection still in its early stages, fragile and tentative. She didn't know him well, not truly. And he didn't know her either, not in the way that mattered. They shared their titles, their responsibilities, but not their hearts. "Are you thinking about it again?" a voice asked, pulling her from her thoughts. Sarah turned to see Cale standing in the doorway, his dark eyes watching her with an intensity she had come to recognize. He had always seemed distant, but there was something in his gaze now that hinted at concern, or perhaps curiosity. "I'm thinking about everything," she replied softly, turning back to the view. "This is a lot to take in. I didn't expect my life to change so quickly." "I know," he said, stepping closer, his presence like a storm on the horizon. "I never wanted you to feel like this was a burden. You don't have to carry it all alone." Sarah turned to face him, studying him for a moment. His words were kind, but there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't just talking about the kingdom. He was talking about their marriage, their bond. "I didn't have a choice, Cale," she said, her voice tinged with emotion. "I did this for my pack, for my people. But sometimes, I wonder if I lost myself in the process." Cale reached out, his hand gently touching hers, his touch warm and steady. "You didn't lose yourself, Sarah. You are still the woman who stood up for her pack, who put them before herself. That's the person I admire." His words softened her heart, but the doubt still lingered. She didn't want to be a pawn. She wanted to be something more, something real. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to be your queen, how to be the mate you deserve." Cale's gaze softened, and for the first time, she saw a glimpse of the man beneath the king, the man who had once been a boy with dreams, just like her. "We will figure it out together," he said, his voice calm, reassuring. "One step at a time. This bond we share, it's not perfect, but it's real, and it will grow, just like us." Sarah nodded slowly, her heart thudding in her chest. She wasn't sure where this journey would take her, or what it would mean for her future. But standing here with him, in this moment, she knew one thing for sure. They would face whatever came. Together, as partners, as mates. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. With a deep breath, she took a step closer to him, their hands still intertwined. "Together," she repeated, her voice steady now. "Together," he echoed, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. For the first time since the ceremony, Sarah felt the weight in her chest ease, even if just for a moment. The future was uncertain, but with Cale by her side, she felt ready to face it. The night stretched out before them, and as they stood together in silence, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find love in this unexpected partnership. Days passed, and life within the palace settled into a strange rhythm for Sarah. Each morning, she woke to the soft sounds of the kingdom's bustling life outside her window, the scent of the pine forests mixing with the distant hum of the people at work. Yet despite the beauty of the land and the luxurious palace that now housed her, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. She was surrounded by power and wealth, but the feeling of being lost, of being apart from the life she once knew, seemed to follow her wherever she went. It wasn't the palace that unsettled her, it was the uncertainty within herself. The bond with Cale, though growing stronger, still felt like a fragile thread that could snap at any moment. She had agreed to this marriage, not out of love, but out of necessity. She had chosen to save her people, her pack, but in doing so, she had left behind the person she used to be. At times, she would catch herself staring out the window, watching the sunset paint the sky with streaks of orange and purple, thinking of the life she could have had. But those thoughts were fleeting. The pack was safe. That was all that mattered. Still, there were moments, when Cale wasn't around, that she felt an ache in her chest. It wasn't loneliness, but something deeper, something she didn't have a name for yet. One evening, as the sun began to set, Sarah found herself standing at the balcony again, watching the horizon. It had become a place of quiet reflection, a moment of peace in a life that had become a whirlwind of royal duties and constant attention. She didn't realize Cale had joined her until she felt his presence beside her, strong and steady. "You've been distant lately," he said, his voice breaking the silence. Sarah turned to face him, surprised by the softness in his tone. "I'm not distant," she replied, though the words felt hollow. "I'm just adjusting." Cale studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't have to pretend with me, Sarah. I know this isn't easy for you. It isn't easy for either of us." His words caught her off guard. She had expected him to be as stoic and distant as he always was, the alpha king who didn't show weakness. But here, now, there was something different. Something human in the way he looked at her. "I didn't ask for this," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't ask for any of it." Cale's gaze softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes. "Neither did I," he confessed. "But I'll be here, Sarah. Not just as your king, but as your partner. Whatever you need, whenever you need it." His words, though simple, held a promise. A promise that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. Sarah didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she could truly find a place for herself in this new life, or if she could ever love Cale the way he deserved. But in that moment, standing next to him, she realized that she didn't have to have all the answers. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. A hope that, despite everything, she might one day find peace in the life she had chosen. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady now, "for being here." Cale nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We'll figure it out, Sarah. Together." And as the night grew darker, Sarah allowed herself to believe in that promise, the first real step toward finding her place in this strange new world. The days blurred together in a routine Sarah was still learning to navigate. Every morning, she woke to the sound of servants bustling in the halls, preparing the palace for another busy day of royal affairs. Each task was carefully planned, each moment filled with purpose. Yet, no matter how many things she checked off her list, there was still an empty space inside her. She found herself standing before the mirror, adjusting the deep green dress that had become her new royal attire. Her reflection looked back at her, but it wasn't the person she had been only a few months ago. She barely recognized the woman staring back. Gone was the carefree girl who had wandered the forests of her pack, finding joy in the simple things. Now, she was the queen of the Northern Territories, a position that carried weight beyond her understanding. Sarah sighed and turned away from the mirror. She had a responsibility now, not just to her pack, but to a kingdom that had never been her own. She had made the right choice. She had told herself that over and over again. She had chosen this life, chosen to marry Cale for the future of her people. And yet, there were days when the quiet stillness of the palace made her question whether she was truly ready for what lay ahead. It wasn't that Cale hadn't been a good husband. He had kept his promises, treating her with respect and offering support when she needed it. But their connection, though growing, was still far from the deep bond that a true marriage should be. There were no stolen moments, no quiet conversations in the dark hours of the night, no warmth that made her feel safe. It was always about duty. He was the Alpha King, and she was his Luna. And though she was grateful for his unwavering strength, part of her yearned for more. As she wandered through the palace gardens one evening, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air, Sarah spotted Cale standing by the edge of the fountain, his dark eyes lost in thought. He seemed distant, like he had something weighing on his mind. As if he sensed her presence, he turned to her, his gaze softening. "Sarah," he said, his voice deeper than usual. "You've been quiet lately. More than usual." She smiled faintly, unsure of what to say. "I'm just adjusting," she replied, her voice calm, though it didn't match the turmoil inside. Cale stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said quietly, "but you're not alone in this." She turned to face him fully, her heart racing. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that they could make this work. But it felt like they were two strangers, bound together by fate and circumstance, but not by choice. "I know," she whispered, though a part of her still questioned if they would ever truly connect the way she had hoped. Cale's gaze softened as he stepped closer. "We'll find a way, Sarah," he said, his voice a little more certain now. Together. There was something in his words, something that made her heart flutter, though she couldn't quite explain it. She had spent so long questioning whether she had made the right decision, but in this moment, she realized that it wasn't about finding the perfect love. It was about building something real, something they could both fight for. Together, she repeated, and for the first time in a long while, the weight in her chest felt a little lighter. She didn't know where this journey would take them, but with Kale by her side, she was ready to face whatever came next. The future, uncertain as it was, now seemed possible. And maybe, just maybe, they would find their way through it, side by side. The days seemed to pass in a blur for Sarah. The palace, once a place of wonder and luxury, had become her cage. She spent her time managing royal duties, attending meetings with advisors, and doing her best to learn the intricacies of leadership. Yet, no matter how much she did, a part of her always felt disconnected from the world around her. The bond with Kale, while growing stronger, was still one of duty more than anything else. He was a king, and she was his queen. They had built something solid, but it was still missing that deeper connection, that spark of love that so many people expected from a marriage. She couldn't help but wonder if it would ever come. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Sarah found herself alone in the palace gardens once more. The moonlight bathed the flowers in soft silver, and the cool breeze carried the scent of the night air. It was a peaceful moment, one she had come to cherish. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the stillness around her, to forget about the pressures of being queen, even if just for a moment. But then she heard the familiar sound of footsteps behind her. Kale. She didn't turn around, sensing that he wasn't there to speak of royal matters. His presence felt different tonight, softer, almost as if he too needed this quiet. Sarah, he said, his voice gentle, a hint of weariness in it. She turned to face him, surprised by the softness in his tone. His usual intensity was gone, replaced by something more vulnerable. I didn't mean to interrupt, he continued. I wanted to see you. She could feel the weight of his words, a rare openness that she hadn't heard from him before. It took her a moment to respond. You're not interrupting, she said quietly. I was just thinking. Kale stepped closer, his gaze meeting hers with a sincerity that made her heart race. About what? He asked, his voice low. Sarah hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should share her thoughts. She had spent so long trying to push them down, trying to be the queen everyone needed her to be. But here, in this quiet moment, with Kale standing before her, she realized she couldn't keep pretending. I'm trying to find my place here, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. In this palace, in this life, it feels like I'm losing myself, like I'm becoming someone I don't recognize. Kale's expression softened, and for a moment, she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected, understanding. He didn't speak right away, just stood there, his presence comforting in its silence. Finally, he reached out, his hand brushing against hers. You're not alone in this, Sarah, he said, his voice steady but full of warmth. I know what it's like to feel lost, to be trapped by responsibilities. But we'll figure it out. Together. His words were simple, but they carried a weight of sincerity that made Sarah's chest tighten. She wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, she realized that perhaps they didn't need to have all the answers. Maybe, just maybe, the connection they were building could be enough. She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. Together, she repeated softly. Kale nodded, a small, reassuring smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Together, he echoed. And for the first time, Sarah allowed herself to believe that the future, uncertain as it was, might hold something more than duty and obligation. It might hold something that, one day, could grow into love. The days that followed were filled with quiet understanding, a growing bond between Sarah and Kale that neither of them had expected. Sarah found herself waking up each morning with a sense of purpose, something that had been missing when she first arrived at the palace. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a connection, a foundation they were both willing to build upon. They had begun to share more than just their duties as rulers. There were moments when Kale would look at her in a way that made her heart flutter, small gestures of kindness that made her believe there could be more to their union. One evening, as Sarah sat at the long table in the grand dining hall, she looked across at Kale, who was engrossed in a conversation with his advisors. His posture was regal, his confidence unmistakable, but his eyes always seemed to search for something. She wondered, for the first time, if he too was seeking more than just an alliance. Maybe, like her, he was learning how to let go of the walls he had built around his heart. The thought was interrupted as one of the servants entered the room, bowing respectfully. "Your Majesty," the servant said, addressing Sarah. "The people from the neighboring villages have gathered to present their tributes. They await your presence." Sarah nodded, offering a small smile. "Thank you. I will be there shortly." She stood and turned to Kale, who had already noticed her movement. He met her gaze and stood as well, his eyes softening when he saw her ready to leave. "Shall I accompany you?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I think it would be good to see them together." Kale's expression shifted to one of quiet approval. Without a word, he followed her as she walked toward the grand hall. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the empty corridors, and for a moment, Sarah felt the weight of her position. She had never expected this life, but here she was, at the center of it all. As they arrived in the main hall, the villagers rose to greet them, their faces filled with hope. Sarah smiled and bowed her head, acknowledging their respect. But what struck her most was the way Kale stood beside her, his presence powerful yet unassuming, a quiet support she hadn't realized she needed. They moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries and receiving gifts of food and crafts. But Sarah's thoughts kept drifting back to Kale. He was more than just the ruler of the Northern Territories. He was a man who had been shaped by his past, a king who had endured hardships no one could truly understand. And yet, in this moment, as they stood side by side, there was something undeniably human about him, something that made Sarah feel less alone. As the evening drew to a close and the last of the villagers left, Sarah found herself standing by the large windows overlooking the gardens, the soft glow of the moon reflecting off the marble floors. Kale joined her, his presence a familiar comfort. "You did well today," he said, his voice low. Sarah turned to face him, offering a small smile. "Thank you, but I couldn't have done it without your support." Kale's eyes softened. "You're stronger than you think, Sarah. I may be the king, but you're the heart of this kingdom. Don't forget that." His words stirred something within her, a warmth that made her feel seen, not as the queen she had to be, but as the woman she was still becoming. For the first time since their marriage, Sarah felt like she was standing on solid ground. With Kale by her side, maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. And as they stood together, in the quiet of the palace, Sarah realized that perhaps love didn't have to come all at once. It could be built slowly, one moment at a time.